started out as an illustrator, doing cartoons in textbooks and things like that. Probably 12 years ago, I think. I'd been working in film. I did a lot of creatures for movies. And I got to a point where I decided that I'd much rather be making my own stuff and exhibiting it in a way that was sort of controllable, really. And I had been exhibiting prior to that. I had had a few little shows. And I'd always been making work in the background. Like while I was working in film, I kept, whenever I had some time off, I would go back to the studio and make a new sculpture of my own. Went to what I really wanted to do, which was sculpting animals and puppets and things like that. I mean, the process usually goes, there's an initial drawing, some sketches, and then I'll go from there and do a maquette, like a small version of the final sculpture. And then once that's all resolved and nice and clean and works, then I'll go into the full-size piece in clay. But yeah, the initial drawing is, that's kind of where it all begins. I think really, I used to try and make things very quickly, like in a month and a half or something like that, but they seem now to take about the best part of 3 months, really. I think sometimes a simple sculpture that can seem really simple to make can wind up being really difficult. Usually they're referenced from someone I know, or often it's like a combination of a few different people. This one was a couple of different people. It was a friend of my mother's. She really was very kind, and my mother took some photos of her and I used that as reference. She had a beautiful face. And the babies are generally from my own kids when I've got photos of them when they're babies. But yeah, some of them are literally a combination of a whole bunch of different people, just like a made-up face. But I think there are a lot of issues with it. It's a very controlled process, so you have to kind of strangle it all the way through. And often that's not very free process. You're still doing things in a very technical way, but you don't want to be sort of just making representative art like a Madame Tussauds thing. You're trying to make something a little bit more interesting. I think that's why I've always changed the scale a little bit and always been happy to kind of throw in some other elements like animals, or make it a little bit more surreal. I know some of the sculptures, like people have had an emotional, like they'll see perhaps a family member or something like that in the work. And so, like with that Pieta is a good example. People would see it and see either a parent or a relative of theirs. That would sort of affect their interpretation of the work, which was nice to see actually, because I had my own angle on it. At the moment I'm really enjoying sculpture because I feel like I've just gotten to a point where I've got the process very robust and it's very clean and efficient. And I use this because it's so robust and it's so heat resistant, and there's no shrinkage at all, which means that it's not kind of giving itself off over time. It's very stable. I think with my work I tend to include them but keep them the same. Like with this particular work, having a baby and an older woman, it's really the same individual, and so it's a nice way of kind of balancing it in a way, and so it's not like a literal scene. It's sort of a bit more abstract. So I think that's probably one of the things that makes art very challenging, because there's no instruction manual. always start with a shape, really. Without a good form or a good structure, it's sort of, you're always going to get a bit lost, and then I usually come up with a concept, and sometimes I'm shoehorning a concept into a shape, and it doesn't always work, but if the shape is good and the concept is good, it's rare, but it's very special. I think ideally, to get the perfect combination of the two, but what usually happens is they kind of conflict in some way. Like you'll have a great concept, but it doesn't really work. It's not a very elegant object. The market is the way of resolving any of the problems that will occur later on in the process. So without a market, you can really get yourself into major trouble if you just launch into a large work, which has happened to me in the past. When you're roughing up the market, it's like a sketch. It's like, it could be the greatest work, or it could be the, it could be not the greatest work, but it has, the possibilities are all there. So, and as you move further into it, often the reality of it sets in, and maybe it isn't going to be great, or it could be great, who knows. Actually, I've sculpted entire sculptures and then just pushed them into the bin. I think probably the worst one, I spent about 2.5 months, nearly 3 months on a piece that I worked really hard on, and then just got to the point and just went, this is awful. And then I kept the clay sculpture for a few years, and then eventually it wasn't salvageable at all. So I've done that so many times. It's scary, actually. I'm sure if I counted how many years of. Anyway, I try and keep them for a while. Like I'll try and keep them for 6 months or a year, and in that time I usually try and I figure out at some point that either it's going to work or it won't work, or it's one of those things where I put it aside and then I eventually come back to it if it's worth making. I've done that a few times. That's it,
looking quite good on this scan. If we start putting the other scans, they look okay, or there's not a lot of chest on it. So I'll work mainly on this scan for you.
Don't worry about stuff like that either.
I'll just blank it.
Even if it was just flat, it wouldn't make any difference to me.
Okay.
I've got multiple heads over there. I tried to use a reference from a piece of medieval sculpture. I can't even remember who did it. It was just something I found. Couldn't get it to work, so I made an arrangement of my own. But the thing is, I think all these arrangements have ultimately been toyed with or touched on in the past. So essentially the structure of it's, one figure comforting another figure. But this work, I think, was challenging because they needed to be essentially polarized, one not being the dominant over the other, if that makes sense.